This episode, I'm joined once again by writer and occultist John Michael Greer to discuss Druidry, primarily taking influence from his book, The Druidry Handbook. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support Hermitix and just keep everything running, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
We're going to be discussing Druidry, which, as I understand, is sort of your, I don't want to say your entire, should we say personal, magical or occult or mystical, all these words interchange at times, but work, but it's your, would you say it's your sort of your primary?
It's my home base. It's the it's the kind of core from which I venture out in various strange directions, which is very much a Druid kind of thing to do.
And as I understand it, so I was trying to, there's very little on your biography online, which is sort of completely understandable, and I don't want to make this into some biographical thing, but as I understand it, you began fairly young, just happening across the book by, was it Magic, the Magician and his work, I believe?
Yes, we're going way back into the distant past. In my teen years, I was, like so many people growing up, I had this, I was convinced there was something out there more meaningful than the things I was being told by, the established religions of my culture. I was not very impressed by American Protestant Christianity, and occultism interested me. One of the books that, the one that you're thinking of, is The Magician, His Training and Work by W.E. Butler. And the other one was a piece called Techniques of High Magic, which is by Francis King and Stephen Skinner. I believe both of them are still available. As introductions to occultism, they were perhaps not the best things in the world, but they were vastly better than anything else you could find at the time. And they don't actually deal with Druidry. I came to Druidry rather later than that, and by, as you'd expect, by a roundabout means. But they certainly influenced me, and they influence me to this day.
Mm-hmm. So there's no clear step at any point to Druidry. It was just you were in the circles and then sort of slowly headed that way?
Well, what happened was actually fairly simple. As a result of working with those two books and a great many other books in the same general tradition, I ended up in an organization that did a medical lodge, an organization that did rituals in that tradition. And one of the other members, a friend of a friend who we brought in, was a guy named Corby Ingold, very interesting cat, and he was a Druid. Mm-hmm. And we got to talking about that. He had gotten into the Order of Bards, Ovids, and Druids very quickly after it was refounded in 1984, 1980, something right around there. No, 1989, I think, was when it became active. But he'd gotten involved in it, and he was involved in a Druid Grove in Seattle at that time. And I talked to him, and we had a series of conversations, and I decided this sounded really interesting, because the esoteric spirituality, the occultism that I was into was very, was very satisfying in its own way. But like a lot of people, especially like a lot of Americans, I've always felt closer to the spiritual world in nature. It's not inside. It's not inside a building. It's out there in the woods, out there in the grassland, out beneath the open sky. I feel much closer to the divine in that setting. I always have. And so I said, hey, this sounds interesting. Let's give it a try. And, the famous last words. But so I ended up joining the Order of Bards, Ovids, and Druids, that particular Druid order. I did their complete course. I experimented with a couple of others. I got involved in another Druid order that was almost on the verge of collapsing, ended up getting tasked with reviving it. And one thing just kind of led to another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So was your experience of Druidry in those early days, has it differed much from the contemporary stuff? Has there been any clear, drastic changes in the way it's understood?
No. Well, now, one of the things you have to remember is that there is no Druid orthodoxy. If there was, every Druid would immediately go start a heresy of their own. Druidry is that kind of thing. It's not about everybody having the same perspective. And so when I talk about the kind of Druidry that I practiced when I first took up work with OBOD, the kind of Druidry I practiced with AODA, the organization that I joined and helped to save, and so on, these are two different things, although they're related. And there are other modes of Druidry out there that are completely different. It's a very diffuse, diverse, complicated scene, and that's not an accident. It's hardwired into Druidry. One of the central concepts of most versions of Druidry is the Welsh word is awen, which is the spirit of inspiration. The idea is that each of us has a spirit of inspiration. Each of us has a connection to the spiritual realm, to the divine, that is unique to us. No two people have the same one. And so each of us is going to walk a slightly different path, and sometimes a very different path, in the course of following your awen. So the Druidry that I practice now certainly is very heavy. It's kind of halfway between the OBOD version that I got from my original studies and the things that I learned in AODA. It combines those and some other stuff. And I know other Druids who do various different things, and it's all the same sort of gallimaufry of various people doing various things that it has been since the beginning of the modern Druid movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one interesting question that I sort of put forward with. So we had, as I understand it from the few books I read of yours on Druidry, we have what we have of you split in. Sorry, right. I'll reel back. In your Druidry handbook, you split it into sort of three eras of ancient Druids, Druid Revival, and then what we consider basically Druidry, contemporary Druidry, and in relation to, and there's big gaps between all of those, really, especially between ancient Druidry and the Druid Revival. But especially, a huge gap. Now, with respect to the ancient Druids, we pretty much, I think, just to paraphrase something you wrote, we pretty much everything that we have on them could be put onto about 3 pages, was it?
Oh, wait, no, it's about a dozen pages.
Okay.
What you have, it may be a little more now that they're doing more work with the old Irish records, but it's not much. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't help that that half of it contradicts the other half. Mm-hmm. Since the Druids themselves, one of the things we know from classical writings is the Druids, it was forbidden to write anything down. It all had to be passed on orally. It all had to be memorized. And so what we've got are traveler stories from Greek and Roman travelers who went through the Celtic countries when Druids were still around. And we have tales written down by Irish monks some centuries after Druids were a going concern. And then we have the extremely ambiguous testimony of archaeology from the same period. And that's about it. There's just not that much. Even so simple a question as, where did they come from? What was the beginning of ancient Druidry? Nobody knows. There are half a dozen different theories out there. None of them have a conclusive argument supporting them, and it's just a matter of, the records didn't survive, and here's my best guess. So, we know very little.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, just relating that back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, the idea of an orthodoxy basically could never arise because you don't have you don't have a doctrine. You don't have an ancient doctrine.
The thing is, people can come up with orthodoxies just fine without an ancient doctrine. Scientology has quite an orthodoxy these days, for example. But Druidry has never quite managed it. Certainly trying to come up with some kind of, ancient, turning Irish myth into scripture, for example. It's been tried. Most Druids, do the horse laugh routine and walk away. The Irish myths and legends are marvelous things. They're great to read. They're a source of inspiration. But you can't let them do your thinking for you. And here again, they contradict each other. They're Irish. Come on. There's a running joke. I think it's the Dublin train station. There's a clock on each end of the main concourse, and the two clocks never say the same thing. And that I recall this is actually a common story by Robert Anton Wilson. He was there at one point, and this English guy was grumbling and saying, "Why can't these two clocks say the same time?" And an Irishman was walking by said, "Why? Then one of them would be superfluous, wouldn't it?"
That's good. Wow. I mean, that's very Irish. So so from what we do have, though, and I mean, I know this is a tricky question. I guess it ends up to a certain extent in, probably back to the idea of the imagination, the spirit of imagination, which you mentioned. I mean, what can we say about these ancient Druids with any certainty?
Well, they probably existed. They passed on their information by oral, their teachings by oral terms, and it could take up to 20 years to learn them all. There were a bunch of them. They were not particularly centrally organized. There were the scraps we have from the Irish legends suggest that an experienced Druid would kind of set up shop, and various people would come to study. Young people would come and study with them. There were female Druids as well as male Druids. And as for what they taught, we know that Caesar says they had a lot of teachings about the planets in the universe, so they knew some astronomy or some astrology, or more likely both. They had teachings about plants and herbs. They had teachings about the gods. They had various important roles in society, but we're not really sure what those were. And by the time we get to that, we've almost run out of things you can say without somebody picking a fight with somebody else. Were they priests? How's that for a really simple question? Nobody agrees.
What do you think? What do you think?
I have no idea. I wasn't there. I wasn't there at the time. We do know that none of the Roman and Greek sources call them priests. So, but what does that mean? We don't know. Again, you want to sit down somebody and just interview them, but unfortunately, they're all dead.
Okay, well, I mean, I used to, obviously, the first ever time we spoke, I did ask you the Hermetics question of the three thinkers living or dead in a room. I mean, I'll ask that hypothetical question now, which probably seems ridiculous, but I mean, if you were to speak to an ancient Druid, I mean, what exactly, is there a key question that maybe is running through as a thread through all Druidry, where everyone's thinking, if we could just ask them this, it might solve some things.
No. Druidry does not work like that. If I had the opportunity to sit down with an ancient Druid and we were, with a couple of mugs of ale or something and just get talking, I just wind him up and let him go. I just say, tell me something. Tell me something about Druidry. I would love to hear it. And then I would shut up and listen and memorize every word.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the big question is then, we're beginning from this very ambiguous, extremely open historical foundation, and the revival begins, I believe, in about the 1800s. In what sense can such a obscure, loose history be revived? What is being revived?
Half the hilarity of the Druid Revival is that it was the Druid reinvention. What you had was people in the early 18th century, possibly back as early as like 1717 is the traditional date for the first foundation of a Druid organization. It may well have been just a little club, meeting in a London pub like so many other social groups at the time. But there were people there who were looking at the Hobson's choice being offered them by their culture. You had Anglican Christian religion, which at that time, of course, was deeply political and mostly focused on do what your betters tell you. And then you had the rising power of materialist atheist science. And those were your choices. Those were the acceptable choices in England in the early 18th century. And a lot of people looked at that and said, I'll take door number 3. And when the various authority figure says there is no door number 3, their response was, well, then we'll make one up. That's how we had, for example, the revival of Greek paganism, spearheaded by Thomas Taylor a few years later. You have people who don't like atheism, scientific atheism, and don't like Anglican Christianity, and say, I'm going to worship the old Greek gods. Well, you can't do that. Well, watch me. You had various people moving in various strange and interesting directions, and one group of them decided that they were going to be Druids. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. We'll have to work it out. And so they did. They got what little information you could get from the Greek and Latin classics. They got the great deal of speculation that was going on at that time, because Druids had become kind of fashionable in those days. This is a little before we had operas starting to be written about Druids, but that did happen. But you had there were masques with Druids in them. There were all kinds of literary productions with Druids. You had I think it was somewhere in the 1740s, the first English book on cultivating oaks, and its title was, of course, The Modern Druid. So Druids were kind of in the air at the time, and this particular group of British eccentrics grabbed onto the label and used it to mean kind of a spirituality that was being invented on the fly. You know, we have a sense that there is something mighty and living and spiritually important in nature, not inside a church, out there in the fields and forests. And we have some traces of this Celtic stuff. What can we do with it? Where can we take it? What does it mean? And so it became a matter of trial and error. It became a matter of, praying into the sky and seeing if anybody answered. Performing rituals and noting what seemed to get a response. It was very experimental. And so this sort of thing just sort of built. And I'm going to contradict one of the things you said earlier. There is a huge gap between the ancient Druids and the Druid Revival. There's no gap at all between the Druid Revival and modern Druid. They flow straight together. Many of the two organizations that I've joined, that I mentioned, OBOD and AODA. AODA was founded in 1912. It was chartered by an English Druid organization that dates from the 1870s, which got its own connection from various wealth sources dating back to Iolo Morganwg around the beginning of the 19th century, and from there, of course, nobody knows. OBOD traces its lineage through the Universal Bond and through a whole series of other Druid organizations going back, at least in theory, to 1717. So there's this direct flow, and not as though there was some Druid orthodoxy with white-bearded patriarchs handing down the truth, but people involved in Druidry who taught younger people. Books got passed on, rituals, prayers, incantations, and it just sort of built over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, it's really no surprise then that... Do you think... obviously you've mentioned those two currents there, the Anglican and the rise of materialistic atheism, but equally this is coinciding with the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. Do you think there was a very clear impetus as well as to why this probably took such a strong... Well, not massively strong root when it first started, but it has remained as a culture.
It endured when most of the other ones didn't. And I think the Industrial Revolution had a lot to do with that. People as early as 1717 were starting to notice the complete carnage that industrialism was inflicting on the natural world. Mm-hmm. You went up into the Midlands, and even by the latter part of the 18th century, and there was desolation. They'd torn up the ground to dig up coal. They'd the coal fumes all over everything, piles of cinders. It was, when William Blake was going on about the dark satanic mills and all this kind of stuff, he wasn't just pulling stuff out of his hat. It looked very diabolical at the time. And so a lot of people looked at that and said, there is an alternative to nature, and we don't think much of it. And yes, I think that inspired a lot of the early Druids. It inspires a lot of us now.
So why do you think it was that the ancient Druids endured, considering there was so little about them, that somehow these figures, this sort of almost like a cultural archetype of the Druid as the it is the quintessential wise old man, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Why do you think that's endured because it's that archetype?
How can one tell? Why does one ancient priesthood become a magnet for dreams and fantasies and hopes and eventually revivals, where another one is completely forgotten? I mean, nobody thinks of the Samothracian Kabiri these days. Even among people who are like trying to recreate the Greek mysteries, they always make a beeline to Eleusis. And why? We don't know. It's there are currents in the deep levels of our mind that pick one thing and ignore other things. Why do they do it? Well, you can ask them. I'm not sure you'll get an answer.
Okay. So, just jumping forward again, I mean, in relation to the Industrial Revolution, Anglicanism, and material atheism, which are all really pretty authoritarian in their sort of projection of their worldview onto everyone else. Do you see Druidry as, is it inherently anathema to the modern world? Is it sort of antagonistic? Or does it just happen to be, well, look, nature was first and we're of nature. We have that spirituality of nature, and then you've come in,
It's certainly not necessarily antagonistic. One of the things that I've noted, for example, is that in Britain, for example, half the people I've met had a grandmother who was in the Druids or a great uncle who was in the Druids. There were various Druid organizations, and it managed to fit in fairly well. I mean, there's a hilarious picture out there that you may have seen of Winston Churchill, a young man, being initiated as a Druid, and he's surrounded by all these grinning guys in white robes and fake beards. And he's sort of blinking there like an owl in sunlight. It's really quite funny. So it doesn't have to be antagonistic. It's one of the things that Druidry has done is kind of what within British society and some other societies as well. It's kind of what Taoism became in China. It's what you do if you want to be a little eccentric. It's one of the things you do. In Imperial China, if you did not want to do the officially approved thing, you wanted to go off by yourself into the woods or something like that, everyone would go, oh, he's a Taoist, you know how they are, and nobody cared. And in the same way, there are a lot of British eccentrics down through the years who, oh, he's a Druid, and they're like that, don't worry about it.
So was there sort of a Druidry peak in the UK?
There have been several. Druidry was extremely popular right around 1800. That was mostly the work of that bizarre force of nature, Edward Williams, a.k.a. Iolo Morgannwg, who was a Welsh poet, one of the most brilliant forgers of fake medieval Welsh poetry who's ever lived. He could write poems by Dafydd ap Gwilym, or he would credit them to Dafydd ap Gwilym, and they were as good as Dafydd ap Gwilym. Some of his forgeries were not actually detected as such until the 1950s. They were that good. But he was the guy who convinced the Welsh that Druidry was theirs, that Druidry was their heritage, that there was something profoundly Welsh about Druidry and something profoundly Druidical about Wales. And so that's the reason why when you have the National Eisteddfod every year or so, I think it is, and there's always a bunch of Druids parading around. But while he was still on the loose, teaching poetry and teaching Druidry, and probably pulled much of it out of his own opium-soaked imagination, it didn't matter. People thought it was incredibly cool. So that was sort of Druid peak 1. There was another fairly important peak between the two world wars, and that was more internal trends within the esoteric community at the time. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of course, had crashed and burned by then. Lots of political squabbles back and forth. The Theosophical Society was tearing itself to pieces. Lots of political squabbles back and forth. The Druid scene in those years was very calm and very accepting and very, very friendly. And so an enormous number of refugees basically fled the burning hulks of the Golden Dawn and the Theosophical Society and became Druids. So you had a lot of Druids active between the wars. And we're kind of in a peak period of Druidry now. There's a lot of Druids in the UK.
So was it primarily? I mean, historically speaking, has the primary focus always been the United Kingdom, or has there been, historical evidence of some different sites emerging at the same time around the globe?
Oh yeah. Now, are we we're talking the revival?
Yeah, let's go with the revival. I mean, with ancient Druidry, I guess the answer is we just don't know.
Oh no! Actually, with ancient Druidry, we have linguistic evidence that Druids were all over Britain, all over the whole island of Britain, all over Ireland, all over Gaul, and straying into what's now parts of Germany and Switzerland, and maybe as far east as the Czech Republic. Outside of there, they don't seem to have really gotten going. Mm-hmm. In terms of the modern world, Druidry started spreading fairly early. By the time Druid organizations were solidly established in Britain, you had things starting to pop up elsewhere. You had the first French Druid organizations. You had the first American Druid organization in 1798 in a small town on the Hudson River in New York State. Australia got Druids in by the middle of the Victorian period. Europe had other parts of Europe. Germany had a big Druid scene back before the World Wars. So it spread very quickly. America had a lot of Druid activity in its time. America has a lot of Druid activity now. It's a good place to be a Druid. We have a lot of trees, and there's a lot of Druids in Australasia. So, but it kind of comes and goes. These days, as far as I know, there are Druids on every continent of the world except Antarctica. I'm hoping we can change that someday and get some Druids down there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So to jump into actual Druidry, the practice, we've spoken about nature, but I mean, what you're finding spirituality within nature is quite an abstract way to speak about it. Is there any specifics with respect to the Druids' relationship with nature? But of course, once again, I'm falling into that problem of speaking about all Druids as the Druids.
Well, right? and of course that's the thing. Ask 3 Druids, get at least 5 answers. Yeah. Certainly, most of the Druids I know, in terms of seeking to experience the spiritual realm through nature. Obviously, spending time in nature is part of it. Nearly all the Druids I know who are serious about it meditate. They meditate in many different ways, but they generally practice some form of meditation. They practice some form of ritual. There again, there's a lot of divergency, but Ross Nichols, who was a very influential English Druid in the 20th century, used to say that ritual is poetry in the world of action. What a poem does with words, a ritual does with actions. And so just as a poem can focus your attention on aspects of the world that you might not have noticed otherwise, so can a ritual. And it is in some ways the most subtle of the performing arts, because the audience and the performer are the same person when it's done properly. And so you have a lot of Druids doing a lot of rituals that attune them to the world in various ways. There's obviously a lot of symbolism moves through that, but the human mind thinks in symbols, so that's kind of hardwired into it. Various other modes of spiritual practice. The important thing is finding some way to get outside the sort of fixed tracks of thinking that we all pick up in school, that are fed us by the media, by authority figures, to just kind of set that aside and get some sense of the tracks of experiencing that are actually part of nature, remembering that human beings are also natural. We're not artifacts. We're a natural process. We are a species of living thing that evolves through the same evolutionary process as everything else. We are part of the world. Our bodies are nature. And so you have a lot of people getting into certain kind of body-centered work that is also a way of tapping into that presence of nature.
Mm-hmm. And you state this beautiful thing in the Druidry Handbook, actually. You say the hallucinatory unreality of modern industrial culture is at least as much a matter of selective inattention as anything else. So this idea of really, is it somewhat problematic and silly to think of nature in that sort of, some huge oak tree and expanses of fields. Whereas if you are in the modern urban setting, as the majority of people are now, you can find nature, you can develop that relationship.
If you've defined nature as as oak trees and vast meadows untouched by human hand or what have you, But of course, that's not only selective inattention, it's falsehood. I promise you, wherever you are, you will be affected by the weather. That's not an artifact. That's part of nature. Wherever you are, you're going to be breathing air. And that's probably not being made by a machine either. If it is, I pity you. And if you actually, even in some big urban setting, there you are in London or what have you, walk out and open your eyes. Notice the birds. Notice the weeds pushing their way up through cracks in the sidewalk. Notice what's going on in the vacant lawn. We live in my wife and I, we live in a small city. We have had quite a collection of livestock come strolling past, the back window of our apartment, for example. There seems to be a little bit of a game trail there. We see skunks. We see opossums. We see lots of rabbits. There's a rabbit warren somewhere nearby. A lot of birds. And of course, wild things and wild plants growing all over the place and so on, despite the attempts of some people to eradicate them and replace them with grass. It doesn't work well. So there's actually a lot of nature everywhere, assuming that you actually take your body with you somewhere. Of course, you've always got that.
So where do you think that sort of segregation mindset regarding, nature and urban, like, oh, that's nature over there, where do you think that comes from?
Oh, well, it's much more economically useful to our lords and masters.
What do you mean?
So,
how do you mean?
No, because nature, we define nature as an amenity that we can stick way off there, and then people who have enough money can go enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to tell people that the world is completely under human control, meaning completely under control of the wealthy and their flax, you've got to ignore nature. You've got to treat nature as though she is completely passive, as though you're all this, oh, the world is going to die, all this kind of all of this is part of feeding the same anthropolatry, the same worship of humanity by itself, which is a core religious expression of our time, and a religion in which I do not believe. This idea, man, the conqueror of nature, this drivel that we get in the media, this notion that we can ignore nature, we don't have, or worse yet, we're destroying nature and we have to stop. But although you notice that it's never the well-to-do who have to stop, it's always everyone else. Mm-hmm. And we could go on for quite some time along these directions, but it's all a way to feed this fantasy of power on the part of the overprivileged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you actually start paying attention to nature as she exists, if you notice the living things that are getting by just fine in the middle of our cities, if you notice the extent to which we are dependent moment by moment on natural cycles, if you notice that, if you happen to know, for example, that a single medium-sized hurricane lets off as much energy as all the bombs and all the nuclear arsenals in the world, then it starts sinking in that humanity is not the big cheese that so many people like to think we are. That we are just one, somewhat moderately successful species in the long history of this planet, that we have evolved, and we will doubtless go extinct at some point. And in the meantime, we could do much more interesting things with our time than concentrate on how much stuff you can stick into a storage vault.
Mm-hmm. It's always interesting, the arguments that defend, we need to save the environment or save nature. Really what people are saying is we need to save the environment which keeps us alive, right? The care. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Ayn Rand, but that's an argument where her theory of selfishness comes into play, right? It's like we're only really caring about these things not for that thing's sake, but because we know that keeps us alive, right? Mm-hmm. So we only care for the waters. So it's like, well, hopefully, if we tend to the waters well enough, we can get back to culling all the fish again, right? So we can, That's all we want. We want to get back to the way things should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the ways that stands out so clearly to me is, again, this relegation of nature to scenic vacation spots. That's nature, places you have to take a plane flight to and stay in an expensive hotel, or go camping carrying 1,000 pounds of crap on your back. It's all very much a tendency to transform nature into amenities for the overprivileged. And then you have other people who are saying, you do like to breathe, don't you? And very often they don't get far. Very often they don't get heard. They're not the ones who are going to Davos to rant at the absurdly overprivileged.
So for you personally, I guess a healthy relationship, quote unquote, a healthy relationship with nature would be one where we move away from the position, the human of having any position where they're the hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. If we can stop trying to be the conqueror of nature, just let go of that bizarre fantasy, accept that we are part of nature. We will never be anything else. It's like like the Zen types used to say, wherever you go, there you are. Mm-hmm. Wherever we go, whatever we become, we're still part of nature, because nature is the whole to which we belong. And what humanity has done, is doing, will do, is all something that nature has done, is doing, will do. If we understand that, if we grasp that we're simply a part of nature that's doing some things that will probably cause sharp decreases in our own population in the near future, and might just render us extinct, that it seems to me that would make us a lot less cocky, and a lot less arrogant, and a little more careful about about how our behavior shapes our own future and the future of the planet. The thing I want to stress here is the planet's going to be fine. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Earth has been around for a very long time. Earth has shrugged off meteorite impacts of a sort that literally incinerated every tree on Earth. Okay, that's what happened when the comet or meteor or whatever they're saying it is now slammed into the Gulf, what's now the Gulf of Mexico, 65 million years ago, and the dinosaurs all died. They literally had a fireball shooting up bits of molten rock, fell all over the Earth. There was a worldwide firestorm. Mm-hmm. Okay, nature can do this anytime she wants to. Did it slow the Earth down? Well, there was a couple of bad years, and all the dinosaurs died, those that were left. But other things dug themselves out. Said, "Oh, okay. Well, what do we do now?" And that's not even the worst extinction crisis we've had in the history of this planet, not by a long shot. The Earth will be fine. Humanity is another matter. Species are disposable. That's one of the things that the history of life on Earth tells us. And modern industrial civilization, if we want that to stay around, we really need to be much more careful. If we don't want it to stay around, that's another matter. But if you appreciate the amenities of modern industrial civilization, it's if you are sitting way out on a limb, as our civilization is, and you want to remain on that limb and not plummeting down toward the ground, don't saw off the limb. Really simple. Take this as sage advice from a druid.
So, yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask, actually, because it seems like just before we get into some of the lore of Druidry, which really interests me, with the three rays of light and these things, just to key people in with, I guess, the Druidry equivalent of theology, though, probably precariously using that word there. You reference a book, and I've seen you reference it countless times, which actually made me search out a copy, and it's extremely difficult to get your hands on a copy now. And it's a book called Where the Wasteland Ends by Theodore Roszak.
Theodore Roszak, yeah.
And
I'm amazed that it's hard to get.
It's extremely difficult to get. Well, not you can go on Amazon, but I would say it's difficult to get a copy which is affordable in relation to to how affordable it should be.
I may mention that to a publisher or two I know, because if it's available at a high price, it's worth reading.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was going to ask you, because as I've been reading it, I've realized that this is a book which is summing up, in a very articulate way, what sort of almost hundreds of other authors are going off at their own small. So Illich is doing his thing with schooling, Alol is doing his own thing, and Rozak is coming in, and he's so articulate. And I wanted to ask why, because you actually reference this in the Druidry Handbook as an essential read, and why is it you consider this an essential read?
Rozak's basic idea was to look at modern technological society with a clear vision, to look at it and say, okay, how are its promises, all these grandiose promises, how are those working out for us? Not just in terms of the outer world. Yeah, we've got all these gigantic steel phalluses that we call skyscrapers. Okay, gotcha. What's it doing to our insides? What's it doing to our experience of the world? What's it doing to our capacity for joy and love and things like that? And he really does a good job of sketching out why this civilization that we've built is destructive of most human values. And so, and talking about what some of the alternatives might be. He himself points out that his book is actually, in a very large part, a commentary on the late poems of William Blake. When Blake was going on about the dark satanic mills and so on, he was actually passing on a great deal of common sense that, had people listened, we might have avoided a lot of really messy possibilities, but we didn't. And so there's that vision of the world as it is, a technological system, a technological society that succeeds in fulfilling its own self-chosen goals, but is destructive of most human values, and what the alternatives might be, and how we can turn away from the wasteland that we've made of the human spirit, and maybe do something different for a time. And so yeah, it's an important book. It's not without its flaws.
How so?
It's got some. One of the core problems in most of the writing by university professors of that era, and that's what Rozak was. It's what I refer to the problem of how far out you can get and still make it back to the faculty lounge in time for lunch. Okay, and so he was willing to go a certain amount, even to talk about what he calls the old gnosis, but don't you dare try to transform that into a belief in actual spiritual realities or a practice of actual spiritual disciplines. No, we can't go that far. That's too far to get back to the faculty lounge. And so one of the reasons that I think he failed, and some of the later books show that failure very painfully, is precisely that he wasn't willing to take his own logic as far as it deserved to be taken, and challenge the industrial vision of reality and say, okay, if this is not true, if it is not true that the world is simply, lumps of matter waiting for us to do things with, if it is not true that we are simply biological machines, if there is such a thing as spiritual reality, what does that imply? Where do we go from there? That leads into territory that was acutely unfashionable for intellectuals in the late 20th century and remains unfashionable for a lot of them now. Because that's when you start talking about things like magic. That's when you start talking like things about spirituality, about gods and spirits and the whole range of things that has been ruled. You can look at this in a Christian mode, but other than that, don't touch it by our society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think even in a Christian mode, that even now that's assumed to what a friend of mine says that Esme Partridge, who's doing a lot of work on this sort of thing in relation to what happens with this stuff when it comes into the academy, actually says that once these things fall into the academy, they become sociocultural relics, right? So it's like well, okay, they thought they were doing magic, but now from the modern era, right, we can see that obviously they weren't. And it's the understanding that, well, if you're not going to begin the understanding historically from their position, then we're not talking about the same thing. at all. And it's bad history, it's bad anthropology, but at the same time, they've also justified and tried to make it apparent that they don't have their own hegemony, right? Mm-hmm. It's all very peculiar.
It's very peculiar. The kind of the anti-hegemonic hegemony of the modern academic. Yeah, I remember back from my second pass through the university where doing classes in religious studies and watching the teachers torture the English language and themselves to find anything in the world that religion can be about except for gods. Oh, no, it has to be of this or that or the other. You can't say religion is the traditional system of human interaction with gods. Mm-hmm. Even though that's obviously what it is, we have to find something else because we have this huge no trespassing sign on the whole realm of actual experience of spiritual realities.
Yeah. And I guess as soon as they even possibly accept that, they say, well, the reason they believe in these gods is because they need Freud would say, well, they need a paternal figure or there's some other reason, blah, 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 right? It's never sincere.
Never they experience to them. Mm-hmm. Even though, all you have to do is pick up any book on the history of mysticism and read accounts of people who have had religious experiences. No, they are not whipping up these beliefs for some sociocultural or psychological or economic or what have you reason. People believe in gods because people encounter gods. Mm-hmm. It's like the reason people believe in life after death. It's because some people remember and some people encounter ghosts. It is really straightforward. And watching people twist themselves into pretzels to try to avoid that obvious reality is just one of those very amusing things.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of gods, I'll ask a very, I guess it's probably a tricky question with respect to Druidry, which we're talking about. What is the relationship between Druidry, gods, and pantheism?
It depends on the Druid.
I knew it.
Very much so. There has been, for many years back, since the early 18th century, there has been a strong pantheist streak in Druidry. John Toland, who was one of the significant figures early in the revival, was the guy who invented the word pantheism, who wrote a book called the Pantheisticon, where he has these sort of pantheist rituals for a society and so on. And yeah, the idea of his pantheism was that the universe is the body of God. The world as we know it, the cosmos, is the physical body of God, and there's a consciousness that corresponds to this, and that's pantheism. Of course, there are many other forms of pantheism, as with anything like that. There's lots of variation, but that was one current in Druidry. You had another that was very strongly influenced by William Stuckley, another very influential figure among the early Druids, who was an Anglican, and for whom a kind of broad church, of a very latitudinarian broad church attitude was the Druids were kind of broad church Anglicans before the fact. They had the disadvantage of having existed before Jesus was born, and so they couldn't actually call themselves Christians. Sometimes he got very silly about that. Sometimes he's playing games with people's heads. But so you have a kind of Christian Druid thing, you have a kind of pantheist Druid thing as people got more and more into research into the Celtic deities, into a sense of what pagan Celtic religion was like. You start getting worship of pagan Celtic deities. You have stuff flowing in from ancient Greek sources that, Druids were taking whatever they could get wherever they could find it. Some Greek writers say, well, the Druids, they really seem to have picked up a lot of stuff from the Pythagoreans. So you have all this Pythagorean stuff going in there, and God as number. And so it really does depend on the Druid. I would say most Druids, if not all, but most Druids believe in the existence of gods. Mm-hmm. A fair number of them worship one or more gods. Mm-hmm. Others have their own way of doing things, and we all just kind of get along.
So why was it you included in the Druidry Handbook? I know this is written quite a while ago now, but the lore of, I'll probably mispronounce this, Einigan the Giant and the three rays.
Einigan Gaur, yes.
And the three rays of light. Is this sort of what we could say is maybe the more common lore, which is perhaps not accepted by everyone, but maybe everyone in the Druid community would be familiar with it? Would that be a way to...
I'd say maybe half of the Druids that I would know would be fairly familiar with the story of Einigan. It's a Welsh story. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain amount of division within the Druid scene between Druids who are influenced very heavily by the Welsh, Breton, Cornish end of things, and Druids who are heavily influenced by the Irish end of things. Just as there's actually a lot of edgy feelings between, the Brythonic Celts and the Goidelic Celts, between the Welsh, Cornish, and Bretons on the one hand, and the Irish, Manx, and Scots on the other.
Mm-hmm. So who is this? Who is this figure?
Who is it? Well, that's Einigan Gaur. What we have for sure is some stuff that Iolo Morganwg had. Where did he make it up? We don't know. Did he get it from some older source? I argue that we did, because there's some details of the story of Einigan that actually, for him to get them right, he would have had to know much more about Indo-European mythology than anybody knew at that time. At the time when this stuff first got written. But so we have the idea that Einigan the Giant was the first being in the world. He was the one who beheld the three rays of light that brought the world into being. And he, on seeing these three rays, which had in them all the knowledge that ever was and ever will be, he took three rowan staves, and carved the rowan staves to include this knowledge. And those were the first. Both the Welsh and the Irish had systems of writing that were based on carving notches on sticks. Whether it's the Ogham or the Colburn, take your pick. But so he carved notches on these sticks to pass on this secret. But according to the story, what happened then, in the fullness of time, there were other people, and a lot of them saw the sticks and said, "Ooh, we should worship these as a god." And Einigan did not like that. In fact, Einigan was so upset his heart broke. He died lamenting, and so a year and a day passed. It's usually a year and a day. And another mythic figure, Menu ap Tirwaedd, Menu the son, the son of the three shouts, happens to be strolling along, and he finds the skull of Einigan just lying there neglecting in the field, and there are these three rowan trees growing up through the holes in the skull. And what happened was that those three rowan staves had taken root and grown and put out leaves and this kind of stuff. And so Menu was able to decipher some, but not all, of the carvings on these rowan staves. And so that was the sort of core knowledge that was passed on by him to the Gwyddons, the Gwyddoneth, who were the lore masters of the Celts before there were Druids, and from them to the Druids and the Bards and so on. So that's the story of Einigan and the three rays of light. And again, the version we have it, or the several versions we have of it, come through Iolo Morganwg, or from him. We don't know which. And it has a lot to teach. Is it true? I'm not even going to go there. But it has a lot to teach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, without going into more specifics, I guess, because that would be very difficult, because as you say, all Druids are of themselves. Is it fairly common to have that quote unquote traditional form of what we could say, like a form of genesis of world creation, to understand where the world comes from for Druidry?
Well, the thing about Druidry generally, and this is true throughout Celtic legends and myths, there's no real clear sense of a creator. I get asked this from time to time. Well, does Druidry have a creator? Well, no, the world is not a manufactured object. It wasn't made, it was born. It's a natural thing, it's a living thing. Like Topsy in the book, it just growed. And so most Druids don't greatly concern themselves about issues of creation, because, again, the world is not an artifact. It's been unfolding for countless ages and will be unfolding for countless ages more, and we only have access to a very little of that time period. So the story of Einigen, it kind of begins with a question mark, because there are these three rays of life that create the world. Where did they come from? Iolo thought they came from a creator god. Iolo was a Christian. Other people pointing back further in the legend say we have no idea.
So, but that's an interesting question with respect then to that, as you say, we have a short amount of time here, and Druidry as a spiritual thing, as a spiritual practice, but one which is now clearly, we can understand it's very open, it's not anthropocentric, it's tuned in with nature, it's moving away from these ideas of, it was made here, this is what we do, then we die, and we, it's all about us. What, once again, it's a difficult question because there's so much difference between Druids, but what can we say of the personal purpose and teleology and the journey of the soul for a Druid? Okay.
Well, this is something, I would say a significant majority of Druids believe in reincarnation. Most cultures around the world do, and one of the reasons for that, if you practice certain kinds of meditation long enough, you start having apparent past life memories surface. It's quite routine. I end up talking people down from this all the time. People have taken a meditation, and then I get the panicked emails saying, I'm having these memories of, that are not mine, help. So whether that's actually, what's going on, to the extent that we can tell, it seems to be. So reincarnation, Iolo Morgannwg has a very specific notion that that souls begin at the simplest forms of life. We have all been paramecia. We have all been blue-green algae. Animalcules, he says, infusoria, using the old terms. And we gradually go through this process of spiritual evolution, learning all the lessons of all these different forms of life. He was writing, by the way, long before Charles Darwin, so it's interesting that he has this evolutionary notion in advance of science. And eventually you reach the human level. And the human level is the point where you finally succeed in getting some capacity for free will. Non-complete. Free will is not an either-or thing, but you can become free to a certain extent. You can make your own choices. And if you succeed at doing that and you align yourself with these sort of patterns of growth and benevolence and virtue in the world, then you finish your passage through several human lives, probably quite a few of them, and move into other modes of being which are not quite as physical as the ones we're used to. And there are lots of those too. It's not a matter of you become human, you succeed, and then you go to heaven. Well, no. Then you start into Gwynvith, the luminous life, which is, again, many different modes of embodiment spiraling upwards into the unimaginable, beyond anything we can bring to mind. And so it's not even so much a teleology as here are these opportunities, and of course, if you screw up, you get reborn. And if you screw up badly enough, you basically flunk and go back into the animal creation and relearn the lessons of that and work your way back up. But I don't know that anyone holds this as dogma. It's more, as Socrates used to say, this is our best guess. This is the explanation that comes closest to fitting the facts as we know them.
It's extremely open then.
Well, the thing is, if the most religions historically have been, the prophetic religions of the last 2,000 years, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and so on, they were really quite a disruption of what had been traditional up to that time. The idea is, you have this figure who claims to have the truth, the absolute unvarnished truth, and you must hold these truths as your opinion about things, and then, you'll be saved or something. If you interact with other religions, if you interact with Hinduism, you interact with Shinto, you interact with the historical traces of older polytheist religions, older, more nature-centered religions, they're not like that. There's an enormous amount of disagreement that's possible with, between, for example, different branches of Hinduism. Which is the most important deity? Ask 3 Hindus, you get 5 answers. And yet they get along just fine. And in the same way, I've had a certain amount of experience with Shinto, growing up with a Japanese step family, and then also pursuing it on my own thereafter. These questions don't matter that much. The important thing is that, here are the ways that we can interact with the kami, the gods of Shinto, and here are the things you can do to develop your own spirituality, and don't worry about it. You don't. When you die, you don't get a multiple choice test, and only if you get a passing grade, you go to heaven. If not, you get the boot in the face forever. That's not the way the universe is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, I mean, this is a very open question. What do you, for you, does it mean to be a druid?
What it means to me is that I am. I pursue my own spiritual path using a set of tools and traditions and teachings that are inherited from the Druid Revival, by way of the specific schools, specific orders that I've been initiated into, that I've been trained in. I use these as the practices that define my spiritual life. I use these ideas as framing concepts to make sense of things. I'm free to disagree with them, but think about them and see, And so it's simply being part of a tradition, part of a heritage, not an ideology.
Mm-hmm. Well, we seem to have covered a lot of ground. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add in about Druidry which you feel we've critically missed?
No, I think the thing is that it is impossible in 1 hour or in a bunch of hours to really get far into Druidry, because ultimately you can't do it by talking over a phone line. Mm-hmm. You need to get out there into the woods. You need to sit in silence and clear your mind and watch what the world is doing. You need to try experiment with some of the rituals, practice some of the meditations, read some of the old books, just get a flavor of it. It's like, I can talk all day and all night about raspberry jam, and that will not communicate the flavor of it to you. Take a spoonful, put it in your mouth. Oh man, okay, now you get raspberry jam. Druidry is the same way. It's a flavor. And you don't, I can try to hint about what it would be like, by talking with you. But ultimately, it's something that each druid does for himself or herself. It's something that each of us experiences, like being alive. That's just the way it is.
So does it still fairly strictly, I mean, once again, talking about it in abstract terms, but does it still fairly strictly stick to that tradition of oral teaching?
No. No, we dumped that a long time ago. And these days, that's why I write books about it. Whether it's the Druidry Handbook, which is one of my best-selling books, actually, or this very recent book of mine, The Druid Path. They're all telling you how to have the experiences. Here are some meditations, here are some practices, here are some rituals, here are some suggestions. Do these things, and then you'll know something about Druidry. And if it appeals to you, keep going. That's how Druids do it.
All right. So you're still working on these detective novels? Is that your main thing
yes.
at the moment?
Oh, yeah. Well, the Occult Detectives series, that's, yes. The first Ariel Moravec novel is now at the publisher. I don't know. I don't have a date yet, but that's in process. Next month, I'll be starting work on the next one. And these are occult detective novels. They're not your ordinary crime things. I'm dealing with magic, with real magic, not the Harry Potter schlock, but magic that people actually do. And I've got a character who is gradually learning her way around under the guidance of her grandfather, the occult investigator, and it's turning out very fun. I think it's going to be a very lively series. I think it'll be very entertaining, and an opportunity to give people a little bit of a glimpse of what magic looks like from the inside.
Mm-hmm. Is it going to be as long as do you have you planned how voluminous it's going to be?
No. This one's open-ended. This one is not like the Weird of Hali, where I knew I was, having this 7-volume trajectory, and the whole thing takes place in 20 years, and it has an end point with Cthulhu rising from the sea and so on. No, this is open-ended. I have my main character 2 days after her 18th birthday, arriving by train in a town she's very rarely visited and getting into the thick of things. And what happens to her now? Well, I'm not sure. I know she's going to be investigating a bunch of occult mysteries under the guidance of her grandfather. I am pretty sure she is going to meet and kind of fall in love with and get very irritated by a werewolf. Not somebody, by the way, who turns into a wolf. We can get into the whole what lycanthropy actually means in occult terms. I know there's going to be a lot of stuff like that going on. Where's it all going? I have no idea. It's open-ended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds very interesting. Are you working on anything nonfiction?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. I recently sent to the publisher there's a set of exercises called the 5 Rites, also sometimes called the 5 Tibetans. They have nothing to do with Tibet, but they actually came into being in America in the late 1930s. They connect into this whole system of Western spiritual alchemy, and I spent a while digging up what was actually going on there and kind of giving the rest of the system. And so I've got a book called The Secret of the 5 Rites that's in process right now. Beyond that, I've also been doing a lot of work. One of my teachers, the man who brought me into the Ancient Order of Druids in America, John Gilbert, died early last year. Mm-hmm. And I have been in the process of helping his widow put his papers together and get a couple of volumes published and get some things into the hands of initiates, some traditions and so on. So that's been eating a lot of my time. I've got other possibilities. I got some other projects I want to work on, but we'll see.
Wow. All sounds very, very interesting. I'll be sure to put the links for both the Druidry Handbook and the Druid Path in the description below. But as always, John Michael Greer, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Likewise.